welcome to the Children's Policy Centre in Conversation with Children's Commissioners webinar series. And this is a very special conversation for Anti-Poverty Week. I'm Sharon Bessell. I'm a Professor of Public Policy at the Children's Policy Centre at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. And I'm joining from the beautiful and unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. In the work that we do at the Children's Policy Centre, one of our fundamental aims is to engage genuinely and respectfully with the traditional owners of the lands that we work on, recognising the importance of connection to country and to community for all children and young people, but especially for First Nations children and young people. And today I pay my respects to elders past and present, to those who have never reached elder status, and to emerging leaders. And I'm going to be introducing the fabulous guests that have joined us in just a moment. But for now, I wonder if I could ask each of you if you would like to provide an acknowledgement and tell us what country you're joining from. Meena, can I invite you first?
Certainly. I'm Meena Singh. I'm a Yorta Yorta and Indian woman, and I'm the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People in Victoria. I live on Wurundjeri country in Naarm in Victoria, but right now I'm joining in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge wherever we are on this continent now so-called Australia of hundreds of countries. We are on land over which sovereignty was never ceded. So thanks so much for having me, Sharon.
Thanks so much, Meena. Helen, would you like to just share with what country you're joining from?
Yep, so I'm coming from the very warm and beautiful lands of the Kaurna people today, and I also acknowledge and pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present, and to the Cultural Authority of First Nations people on our unceded Kaurna land.
Thanks, Helen. Grace?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Grace Leonello. I'm a Year 11 student at Thomas More College, and today I'm joining from the Kaurna lands. I want to pay my respects to all elders, and past, present, and emerging. Thank you.
Thanks, Grace. Hanna, I should say we don't have Grace twice. We do have Grace and Hanna. Hanna, would you like to?
My name is Hanna. I'm joining from Xavier College on Kaurna land, and I would like to pay my respect to past, present, and emerging elder, and all the elders.
Thank you all so much. I will just do a few formal introductions now, and just to begin by saying a little bit about the Children's Policy Centre, which is based here at the ANU. We have three objectives in the work that we're doing. First, to undertake innovative interdisciplinary research on a range of issues relating to children's policy. Second, to seek to connect researchers, policymakers and practitioners who are working on a range of issues to promote the human rights, wellbeing and best interests of children. And third, to communicate research findings to contribute to better outcomes for children and young people. The flagship program of research that we're doing is called More for Children, and that aims to understand poverty in a way that values children's experiences, values their voices, and develops a child standpoint. Today, we are joined by four amazing guests to talk about issues relating to child poverty and poverty for young people in Anti-Poverty Week. We have Helen Connolly. Helen became South Australia's first Commissioner for Children and Young People in April 2017. The position was established under the Children and Young People Act of 2016. The Commissioner promotes and advocates for the rights, development and well-being of all children and young people in South Australia, with a special focus on engaging with and listening to children, particularly those who aren't usually heard. Helen has 30 years' experience as a leader in human services, and throughout her career, she's actively advocated for the well-being of Australian families and children. Helen, welcome. It's a delight to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Sharon.
We're also joined by Meena Singh. As Meena said, she's a Yorta Yorta, an Indian woman, born and raised and living on the land of the Kulin Nations. Meena has a Bachelor of Arts degree, a Bachelor of Law, and she started her legal career, I think as so many of our wonderful advocates did, in the Victorian Legal Aid, where she practiced human rights and criminal law, and was also Associate Director, Aboriginal Services. Meena has led legal services and programs at the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service and the Human Rights Law Centre. Meena commenced as the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People in Victoria in April 2022. In her work, she's passionate about elevating the voices of Aboriginal children and young people to bring about better and more inclusive services. Meena, it's wonderful to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sharon, for having me. And lovely to be alongside Helen, my colleague.
Hi, Meena.
And today we are absolutely delighted to be joined by two members of the South Australian Student Representative Council. So this is a council that was the initiative of Helen with the support of the Foundation for Young Australians. It ensures that young people have a voice in policy decision-making on those issues that really, really matter to them. And so joining us, we have Hanna Somerville. Hanna, we've heard from you just a moment ago, but welcome. It's so good to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be in all of your presence today.
And Grace Leonello. Grace, we're so glad to have you with us as well. Thank you for coming along.
There goes my school bell. But guys, I really appreciate this opportunity. Can't wait to see where this discussion goes.
Thanks, Grace. Grace, you don't have to go because the bell's rung, do you? Excellent. This is very much a conversation, and we're here to hear from Meena, Helen, Grace and Hanna. But before, and I should say there will be time for questions from the people who are participating here. So if you've got a question, please do put it in the Q&A and we'll come to those questions. Before we start the conversation, I did want to take a moment just to tell you a little bit about the research that we're doing at the Children's Policy Centre with children on experiences of growing up in context of poverty, just to set the scene for the conversation we're about to have. We all know the headline figure of 1 in 6 children in Australia under the age of 15 living in income poverty. And in some communities, that figure is much higher. We've been working in a community where 40% of children are living in income poverty. But we don't know anywhere near enough about the experience of poverty from children's perspective, and that's some of what we'll be talking about today. We certainly don't know enough about how to respond in ways that are child-centred. And we'll hear from Hanna and Grace today about how we should be thinking differently in ways that put children and young people's experiences and voices at the centre. But some of the research that we've been doing through the More for Children project is also providing some answers. And I just wanted to share a little bit of that in a couple of minutes before we go to our guests. So our research shows that child poverty has 3 key dimensions that are especially important in understanding and responding to child poverty: material deprivation, opportunity deprivation, and relationship deprivation. To end child poverty, children need to grow up in a context where there is enough money and where there are enough material resources to meet basic needs, and where there is adequate and essential infrastructure and facilities. And infrastructure really matters because there are some things that individual households can't purchase, even if incomes increase modestly. And many of the children we work with have no access to infrastructure or facilities. Children need meaningful opportunities for connection, for learning, for play, and for participation. And they need quality child-inclusive services. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about that today. And importantly, we need to ensure that economic and social structures and systems foster and don't undermine strong and supportive relationships. And this is about transformative and systems change. But we can bring about those changes that really centre the importance and the value of relationships for children and ensure that we don't put in place systems that place pressure on those most valued relationships. I just wanted to really briefly share what each of these dimensions looks like for children when they're growing up in poverty based on what children have told us. Children talk about not having the material basics, not having enough food, not having a secure home, not being able to afford to be warm, not having electricity. And they talk about the cost of living, which they understand deeply because it impacts on them daily. An 8-year-old girl explained, it's kind of difficult to do the grocery shop because sometimes my mum won't have enough money because we have a house that we're renting and we have to pay the rent and all the other bills. So sometimes it's really hard to buy groceries. Children talk about the things that they can't do because of a lack of money. But not just about money. Children have also shared with us what they can't do because of exclusion, discrimination, and disconnection. In writing a message to adults who make decisions that affect children, a 10-year-old girl wrote, "Please give children with no opportunity some hope." And for many children that we've worked with, hope is in short supply, but desperation is common. We have to turn this around. A 10-year-old boy described his fears for the future. He worries he won't have a job or that his job will be very low paying and insecure. He worries that he'll be homeless, as he has been as a child. He worries that his adult life will be as tough as his childhood. And children describe the ways in which poverty puts pressure on relationships. Strong relationships can buffer children, but when parents are under incredible pressure, that creates stress and tension in the households, and it undermines the relationships that matter most. And that's often systems-led stress. When these three dimensions of material, opportunity, and relational overlap, we see multidimensional poverty and often very deep poverty. What does that feel like for a child? In the words of Max, who's 12, and these are his words, "It feels like pain is in the air and devastation is everywhere." We can do much better for children. And so through this conversation, we might refer back to the importance of every child and young person having the material basics, opportunities, and strong and supportive relationships that are not buckling under the pressure of poverty. But now, Helen, I wanted to turn to you to ask you to share some of your thoughts and your work with us. For a very long time in Australia, we've been reluctant to mention the word poverty. One of the early projects that you ran when you took on the role of Commissioner back in 2018, you did this work, was the Poverty Project. Can you tell us why you did that work and what you learned from it?
Sure. Thanks, Sharon. And thanks for that context setting. It certainly mirrors exactly what kids say to me. So the comments from those children are pretty universal across Australia, I think. So you're right. When I started in the role, and as the inaugural commissioner, there wasn't really a blueprint to follow. So I thought what I need to do was go and ask kids what were the things that they thought I should concentrate on and how they were going to determine if I'd been successful after my term. So I went out, spoke to thousands of kids across the country, and one of the things that they kept on saying and writing and kind of reiterating was they wanted to help poor kids. And it was those words. It was help poor kids. It wasn't kids in poverty. It wasn't kids missing out on opportunities. They just said, we want to help poor kids. So the following year, when I was working out a bit of a map for they came up with 5 really clear messages. Help poor kids was one of them. Stop the kids who are being excluded from school. Help them feel like they were, going to be able to face adulthood. So those adulthood worries about jobs and things were very much front and centre. They wanted to look at climate and environment, and they wanted to be heard. So putting all of those, I thought that's a pretty good map to run for my 5-year term. So I thought I'll concentrate on help poor kids. So I thought, well, I probably needed then to go out and ask them what they meant by that. So then it started a whole process, I guess, of surveys, of summits, of conversations, of all sorts of work around what do you mean when you say the word poor? What is it that you understand poor to be? And so hence we ended up with hundreds of conversations. I think I held a summit then with kids who were experiencing or hadn't experienced poverty, but again, trying to get a really clear sense of what was going on. It was the kids who'd had an experience of being poor. They talked about exactly the stuff that you just said. It was about not having money, but more importantly, it was the impact every day on being at school and not having the opportunities. So when other kids could go off to camps or excursions or buy the school photos or any of those kind of things, that was the things they talked about not being able to access. And then there was also the stress on relationships. They were saying you're kind of constantly keeping things a secret. You're having to make up reasons why you can't do things. So often you're kind of you're just not participating in the way that other kids are able to when they're not having to think about how we're going to be able to afford that. So I think so we ended up with an amazing 12-month probably conversation that landed with a report that has kind of been, interestingly, the basis then of so much of my work over the last few years, around really then unpacking each aspect of that, and in particular some of the solutions that they were proffering around. Well, what can we do to actually help kids at home, at school, in the community, because it has such a broad impact.
Helen, have you seen much change over those 5 years?
No. I mean, I think the really tricky thing is the kind of, these are structural issues that need to change. And I know we'll get to some of those things, but I've seen some fiddling, I guess, around the edges. I certainly think things like the sports vouchers were a kind of one of the methodologies that have been rolled out at a state and a federal level to say, look, we want to increase participation. We know that the cost of these activities is prohibitive. Let's see what we can do. I don't think that they've taken on a strong enough equity lens. So I think these universal kind of policy approaches they just don't then address the inequity issues that we've got structurally. So yes, there's some elements and attempts to do something that hasn't shifted. Certainly, we saw in COVID, we saw a whole heap of people come out of poverty because of the fact that there was the payments increase. So all of a sudden, people weren't having to make those tough decisions in families about, do we buy food or do we buy medicine? So I think that certainly they would say, if you track it at a kind of level of against data and research, yep, people came up out of poverty, but short-lived, went back into it. But for that period of time, people were saying that they could participate more, albeit participation for all of us was reduced. So that was a kind of interesting thing. But certainly you'd have to say the kind of housing crisis that we've been experiencing in the last few years, that's now become a really salient theme in the stuff that primary school children write to me about. So in that sense, I don't think their worries have got less. So it's not a great news story.
Yeah. Meena, I remember an SBS conversation that you were featured in a couple of years back before you were commissioner, and you talked about combating stereotypes with stories. Over the past several decades, 2 to 3 decades, there have been some really awful stereotypes, really awful narratives about why people experience poverty, which is very much about blaming individuals rather than going to the kinds of structural issues that Helen pointed to. How do we need to retell the story to bring about the change we need?
Yeah, storytelling is an incredibly powerful tool. And I think one of the key things that helps with storytelling is when people can make a personal connection to the story they're hearing. They can see some element of themselves, if not completely, but they can connect with some sort of aspect of it. And I think when we talk about poverty, and I think, especially COVID really laid clear just how many people are doing it tough and how many people are doing beyond tough, are really just, a knife's edge between, having a home and being homelessness, or, one paycheck away from whatever's next, or not even that buffer. I think with the economic crisis that a lot of people are experiencing, the housing crisis, we're seeing more and more people talk about the challenges. And I think we're seeing more and more people see themselves in those stories. And I think we kind of delude ourselves a bit in this country. We like to think we're very egalitarian and we're very, that we're classless in a way. And so issues of poverty, of disadvantage do get swept and bundled up with a personal failing. And I think when you share those stories that show just how easy it is to slip from a relatively comfortable position into a very delicate, fragile position of stability, more people can connect with that and more people can understand that story. And but we absolutely need to share those stories. And, you know, it's the thing that all of us, absolute majority of us, are far closer to experiencing homelessness than we are to becoming, say, a millionaire or a billionaire. So, you know, where we put our focus on and where we put our resources into is really important. But I think when it comes to those resources, we have to really challenge. I think there's an invisible kind of assumption when we talk about how people engage, how children and young people engage in school, how they can participate in sport, how they can, how their families engage in work or access services. There's a big assumption about the resources that people have to engage in those spaces. And I think we really need to, you know, flip that narrative and the design of those resources to really say, what is it like to be in this situation and to try and access some sort of help? Where, you know, what does it mean if you have no money for the car, let alone have a car, or you don't have money for the bus fare or train fare, and your nearest, say, food bank is, you know, a few suburbs away, you know? What does it mean to actually experience and deal with all of these hurdles? Because there's so much that so many people who are making the decisions and the policies around how we tackle these things, so many of them have no concept of what it is like to be in this situation. And that's why, you know, it's so great we've got Grace and Hannah with us, because we need the voices of people who are directly experiencing what is it like to be a kid, to try and experience and get into certain spaces. We need their voices and their stories front and centre.
Absolutely. And Meena, I wonder if you could just talk us through a little bit about the particular ways in which poverty plays out for some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children.
Yeah, and again, you know, when I think about the impact of colonization and I think about everything that's happened since invasion, and thinking about colonization not as a past event, but an ongoing colonial project, and I think about how it particularly plays out for our kids. You know, Aboriginal children and young people are the, sorry, start that sentence around the wrong way. In Victoria, you know, we have the dubious honour of having the highest rate of removal of Aboriginal children and young people, and who are then placed into some sort of out-of-home care, whether that's kinship care, foster care, residential care. And often what we see is a conflation of issues around poverty being looked at as neglect. So, you know, housing instability, an adult parents' lack of resources to be able to, say, leave a family violence situation, or, you know, a disability that impacts on income, or all these sorts of things. We know these factors disproportionately impact on Aboriginal community, and we know many of these factors come out of that deliberate marginalisation of Aboriginal community, that deliberate exclusion from opportunities in mainstream society. So those three dimensions of material and relationship and opportunity are so acute when it comes to how Aboriginal children experience these spaces, because they're already facing a level of exclusion that has been very deliberate, and then financial exclusion, you know, resource exclusion is an additional layer. And then you can't underestimate, as we were talking about, those stories and those stereotypes that are really harming. We can't underestimate those narratives around, you know, Aboriginal people don't know how to care for their children, or they're neglectful, or they're this and that. And so all of this is tied up in narratives that you have to pull apart. And, you know, if people don't understand the bigger picture and how that impacts on an individual person's life, they're much more likely to fill in the gap with a racist narrative and say, oh, it's just the way Aboriginal people are, which we know is absolutely rubbish, because for tens of thousands of years, our children have been kept safe when their culture is strong, when their connection to community, when their family is well supported. So again, those stories rebuff, challenge, debunk those stereotypical narratives.
Thanks, Meena. I said at the beginning that we would explore some child-centred and some youth-led thinking and responses to poverty, and transport is a major issue for children and young people. We hear about this in our research. It impacts all three of those dimensions of material, opportunity and relational. And it's really exciting to see the work that the Student Representative Council has been doing around transport. Grace, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that work that you are doing on transport and why it matters so much for children and young people.
I might throw this one over to Hannah because this is not my campaign. I'll give her the reins on this one.
That's great. Hannah.
Hi. So with my campaign, we've kind of called it like free fares for all. And with our campaign, we've been collectively working to like garner signatures and trying to like convince like the what's his name? He's like the minister for like the rail, like the trains and everything. But we've like noticed how many kids have like spoken up about like how expensive like the transport can get, and most often it's coming out of like their own money and their parents' money, and it's like taking away from a lot of the other opportunities. And as we think kids have like places to be, including like school, and like they need to get places like food banks, for example, if they need like the food. And we just wanted to like try and create like affordable, reliable, and like safe transport. So we've been working together and working with like Helen and like Nia for trying to figure out how to like guide like our like project into like a real life thing. And so we've managed to gather an impressive 1,600 signatures out of our 2,000 goal. Recently we put it up from 1,500 as we had reached that milestone. And I believe the free fares for our future campaign is meeting up with Peter Malinauskas in roughly a month to begin discussing possibilities and how this can like occur, which I think it's a really good like feat of like achievement. And we're like hoping that we can actually bring some like lessen some of the financial strain on like kids and like the parents, just so like they can have like the connection to schools, healthcare, their work, their sporting activities, their social outings, and even volunteering opportunities to just help the world out.
Grace, sorry, Hannah, I'm looking at the two Grace notes. Hannah, you said there about volunteering opportunities, and I think this is really important because one of the things that we hear from younger children is that they would love to volunteer, they would love to be part of their communities and contribute, but there are often real barriers to young people being involved in that way. What do you hear from your peers about them wanting to volunteer?
I hear a lot of, I've grown up in a community where everybody's like really helpful and there's so many like options to volunteer. But I've heard from so many people that just where they come from and like where they're like positioned, they can't actually go and volunteer because they don't have that like access to help, or perhaps they don't have like the money to like provide. So just like lessening the financial strain is opening up that volunteering opportunity so much more for kids my age, kids in the future, and just anybody really.
Fantastic. And I'm also keen to hear the other thing that really caught my attention when you were talking was you were saying that transport needs to be available and affordable and safe. What does safe transport look like from what you hear from the children and young people that you're talking to?
Well, what we were hearing is that a lot of people were scared that if public transport became free, a lot of people would abuse that factor. And what we were potentially looking at was I've increased security as well. We had a brief discussion on perhaps getting a security person on the trains just to monitor. We had a look at all the other states that have and territories that have been doing the free public transport, and we were trying to guide ourselves based on the mistakes that they've had, just so that we can try and avoid it for ourselves.
Just jump in, Sharon, if I can, and just say one of the really interesting things, and you're right, transport, I would say in my whole career, if there was one common issue over every decade, it was transport. Transport and the safety in transport. I don't know if you've got people who are posting. I think my website might have just put up the Teenagers and Safety report today, and so that's a survey of I think 900 kids who talked about where they feel safe or unsafe. Public transport is a particularly unsafe environment for kids, and so they go into quite a bit of detail around why and what would help. But essentially, it's the poor behaviour of creepy adults that they're talking about. It's not so much their peer behaviours, but that's worth having a look at for anyone online, just to kind of get a real sense of how broad and how deep and how nuanced safety is for young people. I've been really quite surprised at the multiple dimensions to safety.
And I think this is the real power and value of listening to children and young people around what it is that matters and what are the issues that we might make the wrong assumptions about.
Absolutely.
Helen, I just wanted to stay with you for a moment. This week, the Australian Children's Commissioners, Guardians and Advocates have released or will be releasing a statement calling on Australian governments to act to address the structural barriers that contribute to poverty. I wonder if we can turn our attention for a moment to some of those structural barriers. What are you seeing in your work? And you touched on this earlier. What are the things that we really need to start shifting?
I think, well, certainly, I mean, all of us as commissioners across the country work at a systemic level. So our stuff is all about what are the big system changes that need to happen. I think what we would be saying is, you know, what you measure is what matters. And currently we really don't have a really good national approach to measuring child poverty. So we've looked across the globe at places like, particularly our cousins in New Zealand, around what happened when they actually put in a Child Poverty Reduction Act. And so we would say we need a national Child Poverty Reduction Act that actually gives responsibility to a minister that is cross-portfolio and brings together a range of kind of policy and programmatic responses to how you might address poverty at a local and family level. So we need to do that. We constantly are saying we need to raise the rate. So, you know, we need to ensure that families are able to have incomes that bring them above the poverty line, and we need to have a consistent measure of the poverty line itself. But then there are things in there like about increasing the minimum wage for apprentices, reducing the costs of higher education. I mean, I think all of these things are kind of structural barriers. So our message is pretty much saying what we know is that if you grow up as a child in poverty, you've kind of got 3 times more chance you're going to be an adult in poverty. If we want to break the intergenerational nature of poverty in Australia, we really do have to address it at that kind of structural level, which is all of those kind of things. But also, I think we're talking about legislating around the pricing on medical goods, on period products, on visits to the GP, all of those things. I think one of the things that I've noticed in the last few years in my conversations with kids is very few kids now go to the doctor. I used to say that universally health was a space where all little kids went to the doctor. not all little kids go to the doctor anymore. In fact, it's quite rare. And my message now is all kids go to the chemist. And perhaps we need to really start looking at what that looks like in terms of primary prevention and healthcare. But anyway, that's another conversation. But it is that stuff around people can't afford to visit GPs, oral and dental care. We need to have systemic kind of look at those things, saying these are access issues. If you start off your life with poor oral health, then your chances of having poor health for the rest of your life are so greatly increased. And then that in itself then leads to the whole things around access to education and jobs and stuff. So for me, I'm really, whilst our statement as commissioners is intended to be picked up and debated and used as a conversation starter, it doesn't go into obviously all the ins and outs of poverty. What it does is say, actually, as people who are charged with being advocates for kids across the country, we're really concerned about the fact that there isn't a national response to what we're seeing in terms of children's experience of poverty. And we're a bit fed up, I think, of the conversation being all about families or all about individuals and not enough reference to the fact that this is intergenerational. And if we really want to stop it, we've got to connect with how kids are experiencing it. Yeah.
And Helen, I think the other part of that is that we often see issues bouncing back and forth between federal and state governments, and federalism gets in the way of a national approach. And so I think this statement from the commissioners across the country is so incredibly important and powerful. Meena, I just wanted to invite you to come in on that. There's some comments that you would like to add to what we need to be doing?
I just wanted to add on the point of free travel, free public transport. The Commission in Victoria last November tabled our systemic inquiry into, it's called Let Us Learn, and it's about how children in out-of-home care experience the education system. And newsflash, it's usually not great, and they have much poorer outcomes from the education system, and they have far less engagement, and often, experience that intersection of disadvantage, of child protection, and the stigma that goes over that, and poverty, and how that all plays out in a school context and your ability to engage in school. But we had our youth council very heavily involved right the way through, from the design of questions to ask, the actual asking of questions to young people with the consults, looking at chapters, coming up with recommendations. And one of the key recommendations they came up with was for children in care to have free public transport, because it was such a compounding factor on top of the fact that, especially for your children in residential care, just the complete lack of access to resources. So I think, I think it's fantastic that Hanna's campaign is really focusing on that. And I think, in some ways it's such a no-brainer. It's there's really simple things, but I think the key is that poverty costs money. Poverty ends up costing people much more money over a period of time, and certainly in the short term, compared to if you've got some sort of steady income. Because when you're living in poverty, when you don't have kind of that ability to plan or stage things out or whatever, there's just no stability involved, and it ends up costing you money. And this is going to sound weird, but there's this wonderful passage from one of Terry Pratchett's books, the Discworld series, and I can't remember which book it is, but there's a wonderful passage that talks about how poverty is expensive, and it uses the analogy of, every year someone, who doesn't have very much money, who's working, very hard for not very much, has to replace their shoes, and every year, because their shoes get worn out, and all they can afford are the cheap shoes. Whereas someone who's doing better can afford to pay for the expensive shoes up front, but have those shoes last much longer and potentially have more pairs of shoes. So the wear on them is spread. But for this person, they're constantly putting out this money to deal with a simple issue that could be helped with just a little bit more money. And so I think when you have to understand just the visceral nature of the impact of of poverty and how it literally is the difference between, whether you can, we saw it during COVID. We're seeing it now, especially during with the housing crisis. Do I pay the rent? Do I pay my medication? Do I eat? These sorts of choices and how they manifest for children and young people. And, from what Helen was saying earlier, we shouldn't have kids who are so acutely aware of the impact of money on their lives. But we do. We have these children who are experiencing these things, and it ages them. The worry that they have, the stress that it can cause them. That's often something we don't talk about. That it's poverty is a health issue, poverty is a housing issue, poverty is is a whole range of issues that must be looked at interconnectedly. And think about, you address a policy issue over here, you need to see how it manifests over there. If you reduce access to if you cancel out bulk billing, well, there goes access to health, and those and that means people put off things that they need to have addressed medically, and for some people it becomes the thing that can't be addressed. So we have to understand poverty and its multifaceted impacts and address it accordingly from that impact, and think aspirationally. What do we actually want every child and every family to have in this country, and how are we as a collective community going to ensure that every child has that access to that aspirational future?
Meena, that's so beautifully and powerfully put. And what we hear again and again from children and from parents is that being poor costs money, and being poor costs time. The amount of time that people need to put into finding the shoes that are affordable. One mum said to me, when I asked her about how she'd spend a typical day, she said, I spend all day, every day looking for food that I can afford to feed my children. So it's, and that load is enormous. Thank you so much to the person who's put the full Terry Pratchett quote from Men at Arms into the Q&A. That is fabulous. Thank you. And we'll be coming to those questions in just a moment. But Grace or Hannah, I just wondered if Meena made the point then, we need to think aspirationally. We need to think about what it is that every child and young person in Australia should have. I wonder if either of you two wanted to share with us your thoughts on what it is that every child and young person should have in Australia. We're a wealthy country, but lots of children go without. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Grace?
Yeah, I think the overall thing that all young people need right now is just affirmation that we will be okay. I think there's a lot of anxiety over housing, over employment, over food, over fitness, over mental health, physical health. It's endless. And the amount of affirmation, validation, or proper physical stuff that we can see that is going to help us, there is a complete lack of that, especially in my perspective. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Grace. That is, hope is so important. Hannah, did you want to add any thoughts to that?
I definitely agree with Grace. A lot of kids nowadays are so worried about financial crisis happening to them when they're older, as they're hearing a lot of negative things coming out of a lot of old people that are older than them mouths. And I feel like it's just getting them so stressed. And I feel like just giving kids reassurance and just a way to talk it out is really helpful, and it's a way to calm them down and assure them that everything will be fine and it is getting sorted.
Thank you both. And I think that responsibility that adults have to both listen to children and young people, but also to reassure and support is really, really critical. So thank you for raising that. So, Meena, I wanted to come back to you, and you mentioned the Let Us Learn report and the inquiry around it. A couple of weeks ago, we spoke to your colleague Leanna Buchanan about the report, and to Amelia Hunt and Ruby Sate, who are members of the Youth Council. and that is recorded and available at our website. So people, please listen to that. It's a great conversation. But I just wanted to come back to that report and what you heard from Aboriginal children in particular. And you talked about transport, but were there other things that came out of that report that you'd really like to highlight and to share with us that really matter to Aboriginal children?
Yeah, for sure. You know, because Aboriginal children and young people are so overrepresented in our child protection system, the issues that we saw impacting on non-Aboriginal children impacted on them as on Aboriginal children as well. But there's always the underlying, sometimes overlying, overt experiences of racism. And when we developed our questions with our youth council about what would we directly ask children and young people, our questions didn't have anything about racism. When we talked about education systems and things, we were much more focused on just generally what was the educational experience for these kids. And 50% of the Aboriginal kids that we spoke to just raised racism off their own bat. And so it's an extra dimension of exclusion, not just from peers, but sadly and too often from teachers and from staff in schools. And it's honestly the number one issue that is consistently impacting on all Aboriginal children and young people that I speak to and their families and their communities. Every forum I'm at, racism in education is number one. We're also doing some work with the South Sudanese community, with young people, and hearing about some of their experiences as well of racism and other communities of colour. And we're not going to get anything right for anyone else unless we start to understand and get it right for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who are experiencing racism. So it's the racism that kids can experience is really, it can be really overt. And with the referendum, the 1-year anniversary was on Monday. The levels of racism became more and more obvious and more intense. And I don't think that's abated. I think that a referendum outcome has really allowed people to just be much more transparent in their attitudes about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think, in Victoria, we have child safe standards that include a child safe standard that's about creating culturally safe organisations, and also includes a minimum requirement to address racism. And so we really need non-Aboriginal people to step up with their try to find the right word, with their reality and their understanding of how racism plays out, how it affects children and young people. And and racism is also baked into so many of our systems that we see. And again, it's not just Aboriginal people that experience it; it's so many other people. In how you go and access services and how you get perceived as your neediness and your, should I be giving this service to you? What are you going to do with it? Or should I be helping you out in these sorts of ways? So it really, again, has a multidimensional impact for Aboriginal children and young people. Something I just wanted to say that I didn't say earlier about the specific impact of poverty is its criminalising nature, and that we see again for Aboriginal children and young people who are overrepresented in the criminal legal system, and of course 10 years old, you can get involved with the criminal legal system. So many of the children, a few years ago, the commission, before I was commissioner, did Our Youth, Our Way, which focused on experiences of Aboriginal children and young people in the Victorian justice system. And so many of those first interactions with the police were because of financial hardship type offences. So stealing something to eat, stealing something to drink. I remember as a lawyer at the Aboriginal Legal Service having we had a client who was charged by the police because she stole a packet of pads. So period poverty manifesting as with a criminal response. And for so many issues, we see a criminal response coming to meet children and young people in a really disproportionate way. And we all know, if you're an adult and you have that entrenchment and poverty continues, that likelihood of continuation, from youth criminal interventions to adult is going to continue as well. And that also severely limits your opportunities to get out of that cycle of that intergenerational poverty.
Meena, some of those things that you commented on about trying to access services and the way that you're treated, I think we see in our research applies to people who are poor, who live in poverty, who are immediately assumed to be a particular thing because of their financial circumstances. And then I think we get the intersection, and the overlap between race and poverty and other issues. Helen, I just wondered if you wanted to comment on any of those observations that Meena's made from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and completely agree. The intersectionality as it applies to children's lives. I would also say that I've just done a pretty big piece of work on racism in schools for refugee and migrant kids, and the institutions are racist in such a pervasive way that children don't even necessarily now think it's worth raising, because it's the everydayness of being called certain names, whatever it might be, in different places is so huge. I wanted to say one of the things I've really noticed recently was a piece of work that I've been doing that wasn't about poverty but tells the whole story of poverty, which is engaging with kids in primary schools about their neighbourhoods. So I've been going out in whole classes and mapping where kids go. And it's as I've been to each of these schools and I've looked at what they've drawn, it becomes so palpable that the poorer the child, the less things on their map. Like, it really is so in your face that I've struggled to find the words to write a report around it. But what I do is look at these maps that say, for our really poorest kids in our poorest suburbs, in our poorest schools, it is not unusual for them to have a school and home, and maybe for us it's OTR, the on the run kind of service station, and maybe a park, but not always. So this paucity of things and resources and places that they go to between home and school is huge. You overlay that with more affluent areas and it's chock-a-block full of sports venues, activities, events, pools, you name it, where kids are going. I think for me, and it goes back to something I think what Meena said was about what is our aspirations for children. And it is this stuff around, if we could have a Bill of Rights, I would want something that said there was a charter for childhood that said every kid in Australia, by the time they reach 18, in an island nation, should have been to the beach, should have been swimming, should have had their hands in dirt, should have gone on a school excursion, should have, I don't know, watched a movie late at night, eating popcorn, whatever it might be. I think the elements of good childhood and a happy, safe kind of environment speaks to the stuff that we see when I'm out with kids that they don't have. So they don't, it is absolutely a rarity in some of these communities that I go to that have been to a pool. School excursions are things that just don't happen. So one of the things we've been doing here is investing in giving grants to schools, poor schools, to say, here you go, bring your kids out of their environment, because that whole stuff around you can't be what you can't see is absolutely real in this kind of space. So whilst I've always say cannot fix this stuff without big structural kind of change. We also need to continue to act at the local level as well. So we can't just wait for the big changes to happen, because all of us online have probably been involved in slow advocacy. In the meantime, there are things that we need to do. Things like, why does every primary school, which are 500 metres apart, need a different uniform? Why can't we have a generic school uniform that says this is what kids wear to school? Therefore, you can swap and change and you can get them cheaply. Why does everything have to be branded and monogrammed? Why is it that we kind of made the case that everyone can have breakfast? Well, not everyone, but we made a case for breakfast. My big advocacy at the moment is school lunches. We need to feed kids. We might not feed every kid, but if we feed every kid that's in a lower category school, then we're going a whole heap of way to helping the whole family do these kind of things. So school excursion funds, free transport to and from school, free after-school activities. These are the elements of anti-poverty strategies to help kids now, whilst we work on these big picture changes around raising rates of income support, building more houses, having national kind of frameworks around anti-poverty, childhood task force, whatever it might be. I think we really need to be coming from both ends to make an impact on the now of children's lives.
Helen, and when I hear you talking particularly about what's often missing from children's communities, we see they're playing out so much as opportunity, the opportunity deprivation that is part and parcel of growing up in poverty. But you talked about a childhood charter, which could range from being able to go to the beach through to having enough food, and both of those things matter. Hanna and Grace, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If we had something like a childhood charter, which captures the things that every child in Australia should be able to have, what would you love to see in that charter? Who'd like to lead off? It's sometimes hard on the spur of the moment, but is there something that you would definitely add to that charter? I think we would have to put transport on, because we've already talked about that, but what are the other things that you might add? Hanna, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll kick off. I feel like I'd love to add, obviously you guys spoke about getting them out of their environment. I feel like a good learning way of getting out of your environment would be bringing in camps, some more camps and everything. I feel like it's a really good hands-on way to just get out there, learn things, meet new people. And in some of those you can learn food-related things, medical-related things that can help them in the future and ease some of the burden off of them.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hanna. Grace, did you want to add anything to the charter we're putting together here?
Yeah, I think as Aussies, every child should be able to have swimming lessons. I think that is a real strong part of our identity in Australia. If we were to say, let's let all kids go to the beach and every child should go to the beach, we also need to have things like swimming lessons in place for that to happen safely. And I think in our culture, it's sort of, a thing that every kid, should have that sort of lesson under their belt, as if it's going to school every day. It's sort of the same standard. That's it.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Grace, can I say, Grace, I think it would be good for you to talk about the free fitness stuff as well, in terms of the activities for mental health. That's your campaign, isn't it?
Yeah, so Free for Fitness is basically, we know the links between physical activity and social connection, good mental health. And so that's what we're trying to produce with this campaign. So we've been talking to the free fitness campaigns like Salty Sips and spreading on social media free fitness opportunities for young people to get active and get out there. We've also been talking to ministers like John Fulbrook about the sports vouchers that we have at the moment and how there are gaps within those. So they're supposed to address sporting and fitness, yet we see sporting voucher. So is it really covering all students? Not really just yet. So that's been one of our focuses too. And looking beyond this, the cost of fitness, also looking at the safety of accessing that free fitness.
It's a fantastic campaign, Grace, and it's so important in terms of connecting young people to one another and into their communities.
Yeah.
We're starting to get towards the end of the conversation, and I do want to just for a moment bring it back to some of those issues around child protection and poverty. Someone asked in the chat about the numbers and the proportion of children in Victoria, of Aboriginal children who are removed into out-of-home care, and Meena responded in the Q&A, but I just wanted to point to that, where Meena has said as a proportion, there are about 9,000 children in Victoria in out-of-home care, and 2,900 are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. That's a fairly shocking proportion. So I think those numbers really matter. But Meena, I just wanted to ask you, one of the things that we often hear from parents, but also from children, including very young children, is that they're afraid to share their challenges or to ask for help for fear that poverty will be misunderstood as neglect with catastrophic consequences. And that's exactly the language that you used a moment ago. And for Aboriginal children and families, the stakes are very, very high. I just wanted to ask if you would be able to share a little bit more about those issues with us, and to perhaps speak to what really needs to change so that we stop that misrecognition and really what is abuse in terms of removing children.
I think the help aspect and being able to ask for help is such an important feature. When we look at reasons for removal for Aboriginal children and young people, for any child, often it's, you can see things like a history of removal, one or more parent was removed, or, was in out-of-home care, which always screams to me as, well, we're failing now 2 generations of children in that family. We've removed a child, they've gone on to have a child, and now we're thinking about removing that child. So that always screams to me as a failing of the system. But we make it really difficult for people to ask for help in ways that won't automatically have a statutory intervention. And so many of our child protection systems around the state around the country are really blunt tools for dealing with the really nuanced issues that see a child in an unsafe environment, or even whether determining that child is in an unsafe environment, whether it's poverty or neglect, whether the child is at risk of being unsafe or has already experienced unsafety or lack of safety. So how we understand asking for help is really important, and I think particularly for Aboriginal community, Aboriginal community control organisations play a significant role in being able to provide those services and to say, we get it. You don't have to explain it to us. We understand. There's people in those organisations, Aboriginal and allies, who understand the needs of Aboriginal community, and so community can go and access services. And, in Victoria, we're seeing more ACCOs taking on more child protection roles. So, some ACCOs getting notifications and making the decisions about whether or not a child should or shouldn't be removed. But most importantly, building potentially on relationships that are already existing because the family had been using, say, that particular ACCO for other services, or able to help continue on with services that don't need to automatically mean the removal of an Aboriginal child from their family. And so I think there's so much to learn from Aboriginal community and how we always have pre-invasion and post, how we have always wanted to look after our children and be able to support them, but to also say, help is a-okay, and help from our peers and our family especially is a-okay. And so how do we, when we remove a child, most likely place they're going to go is into kinship care. But we see such little support for kinship carers, those families, those extended relatives that look after children and young people. When really culturally, having the support of your family, not just in Aboriginal culture, but in so many other cultures, is just the way you raise kids. It's a village to raise a kid. And, I my sisters don't mind, but I always talk about the fact that, I had a hand in raising my nieces and nephews, and, my mother and my father did in raising their grandchildren. And it's just cultural, and recognizing that that cultural practice is a strength and not a weakness of the immediate parents, of the birth parents, is just such a different framing of what a family is and who raises a child. And it hits up negatively with a Western notion that of mum and dad and the kid, and that. But it's ironic because I always think it's ironic because it's hard being a parent when you've got all the resources. So, I think it's a bit of a fallacy that it's an easy thing to do to raise children. It's not, and everyone needs support and assistance. You need to make sure that support and assistance comes without the guilt and the shame and the criminalizing, that feeling of being criminalized for wanting to have help, wanting to need help. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just add, Sharon, one of the things I would, that's great, Meena. I think putting in my charter for childhood, I think I'd have something that said, if as a kid, if we reach out, then we will be supported, not punished. Because I hear it so often that there is an assumption, whether it's in this space, whether it's with kids whose mums go to jail, whether it's kids living in families where there's domestic violence, whatever it might be, there is this kind of narrative that we have, and it's it's more than a narrative, it's reality, that if you reach out, negative things will happen. So we have this kind of mandatory notification rather than mandatory support and action. So I think we need to really, it goes back to the earlier stuff you were talking about, which was how do we flip the script, really? How do we say this is so important that if we want to change, if we want to make intergenerational change, that we need to support families to actually stay together and not have a response that removes kids from family and community, because, it's the whole case of it's not working, in terms of outcomes for anyone. So let's actually start to do something a bit different in this space and ensure that if you're a kid and you say, actually, things aren't good, then you're going to get the support that you need, because you're going to be able to say, and this is what I think needs to happen for my family and for me to make me feel safe and supported.
And I think that's so powerful, and that's what we hear from children very often. And what we often hear from children in our research too is how much they would love to have intergenerational relationships with people in their communities, but don't have the opportunity for that. So, how do we start to build those villages so that all children are supported by everyone around them?
And we need to stop, we do it so often. We deal with children as children and adults as adults, and that we've lost. I think one of those things, those byproducts or unintended consequences of a focus on child-safe environments, and I'll be bold enough to say it, that it means that we live very separate lives. So we went, oh my goodness, there's so much risk attached to any of this. Let's separate out the lives of children and adults. It's time actually, which is not how a village works. You don't have, the children's village and the old people's village. It is about actually starting to create far more dialogue and opportunities for people to actually problem solve together, because neither one on their own has got the answers.
We are going to need to draw this conversation to a close, and what a terrific conversation it has been. And I'd love to end by asking each of you what you would ask. I was going to say what you would ask of government, either federal or your own state government, but perhaps I'll add government or your community in this anti-poverty week to do differently, to focus on. Helen, would you like to lead off in terms of what your key ask is.
Yes, for me, the key ask, and I say this as the chair of Anti-Poverty Week in South Australia. I've been doing this a long time. I think it's about recognising that poverty is not the fault of the people who are poor. That it really is about saying we have to all understand that we create poverty through the structures and the systems and the policies and procedures that we implement, and it is within our reach to stop it. And to hark back to good old Bob Hawke, we really do need to ensure there is no child poverty in Australia within the next couple of years, because we're running out of time.
Grace, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what your ask would be or what your message would be.
Like I said, I think it is within our reach. We just need leadership and people empowered to make those right policies to really make a difference, whether this be through making the access to healthcare easier, making the access to housing easier. We just need to be a bit more on the ball and proactive rather than reactive, I think.
Absolutely. Hanna, love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I can agree with both Helen and Grace with that being more proactive about everything. I feel like a lot of opening up a lot more of safe space. A lot of I know the governments can open up a lot more safe space, and I feel like I would love for personally my government in my area to open up some more safe places, and I would hope all the other areas do that as well, just to get it out to people and be this is a real issue, we are addressing it, and reaching out to everybody else as well.
Thanks so much, Hanna. And Meena, can we ask you for perhaps a final word on what your ask would be of government or perhaps broader community?
I think for those of us who haven't experienced poverty or anything like it, we need to suspend our own realities and our own assumptions about what the experience of poverty means, and to make space for people with that lived experience enduring poverty right now to be able to speak up and talk about what are the practical things that are going to help, and then bring the political willpower to and the community goodwill to make real change, because you address issues of poverty, so many other things are going to flow from that, for a better and more equitable community.
Thank you, Meena. I think in a country as wealthy as Australia, where we are often at the top of particularly wealth charts, that 1 in 6 children across the country, and in some communities many, many more, live in income poverty is simply unacceptable. It's something that we can change. It's something that we must change. And I think some of the ideas that each of you have shared during this conversation are part of that change that we need to make. Grace and Hanna, the work that you're doing around free transport, around free fitness, around connecting young people to one another, to their communities, is so important. So thank you for that work. Thank you all for the work that you're doing. Just a reminder that this webinar will be available on the Children's Policy Centre website as soon as we can get it up, usually within a week. And please watch out on our website for details of the rest of our In Conversation with Children's Commissioners this year. In a couple of weeks, on the 30th of October, we're going to be joined by the National Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollands, about the work that she's been doing around child justice. And that really connects with some of what we've been talking about today. So please do join us again for that. But for now, thank you so much, Helen, Meena, Grace and Hanna, for joining us. It was a fantastic conversation. And thank you so much for sharing your experience, your expertise and your insights. And as I said, thank you so much for the work that each of you are doing. It really does matter. Thank you to everyone that joined us today, especially the person that put up the reference to Terry Pratchett. That's fantastic. And we hope to see you again in our next conversation. Thank you, everyone.